Hey, today I want to take you through a little timeline, specifically more kind of around product adoption. If you're doing something new or different, I want you to know about this because it kind of blew my mind. So I'm going to take you through the timeline of the automobile, all right? And some things I'm guessing you don't know. There's some stuff I don't know. And by the way, I want to give a lot of credit to Piero Scaruffi, and he's got a website, scaruffi.com. You can check out under scaruffi.com politics cars. He's put together a great timeline, and I grabbed a couple things from over there. And really, there's a lot more than what I'm going to tell you here. But starting 1876, Nicholas Otto invented the four-cycle internal combustion engine. So that's the first gasoline engine, right? 1883, Gottlieb Daimler, a former auto engineer, built a high-speed gasoline engine for vehicles. But at this stage, all the vehicles really on rail or water or something like that, right? So 1885, Gottlieb Daimler and Wilhelm Maybach, another auto engineer, invent the motorcycle. I didn't know the motorcycle was from 1885. Also, you're starting to hear Daimler, Otto, Maybach, Carl Benz. Listen to these names because this is where a lot of the terminal or like some of the brands and stuff came from, in starting in the 1880s. So 1886, Carl Benz builds the first gasoline powered car. Actually, it built it in 1885. He patented it in 1886. So the first car is really kind of built, put together, and starts to get driven in 1886. But it's by itself, right? Otto's patent on his engine, so that engine back in 1876, it expires in 1886 and becomes public domain. So now you would think, hey, we can start putting this stuff together and we can really make it happen, right? Okay, so in 1888, John Dunlop invents the pneumatic tire in Ireland. 1888 also is the first long distance trip taken in an automobile. And did you know it was taken by a woman, Bertha Benz? She drove from Mannheim to Pforzheim. I hope I'm saying those at least somewhat right, and back. That's a distance of 180 kilometers, or about 112 miles. So 1888, 1886, the car is made. It's a three-wheeler. It's got a 0.75 horsepower engine. But it runs, and it runs on gas. And she took her two sons and they drove 112 miles round trip in this car. You would think 1888 cars should suddenly be people would be adopting them. It'd hit the news. They'd hear about them. They'd want them, right? Well, so the first commercial cars made in 1890, like that's 2 more years, right? And that was using a Daimler engine, and that was Rene Panhard and Emile Levasseur. They had a machine shop in Paris. 1892, the William Morrison garage in Chicago introduces the first electric car in the US. Okay, 1892 is the first electric vehicle. Then we go 1893, Benz introduces a gasoline powered car driven by a 3-horsepower engine and has an electric ignition. So think about that, 1893, you've seen all these old movies with the crank and stuff. The electric ignition was invented in 1893. And again, the first cars being driven around 1886. So we're talking 7 years later. In 93, Edward Murphy founds Pontiac Buggy, okay, later Pontiac Spring and Wagon Works in Pontiac, Michigan, to make horse-drawn carriages. You heard that right. 1886, the car is invented. 1893, Pontiac is founded to make horse-drawn vehicles. Okay, 1893 also sees William Maybach inventing the carburetor. Okay, so that's kind of cool. The Dreher brothers manufactured gas power engine in Massachusetts. That's the first one in the US. That's in 1893 as well. In the first race, Emile Levasseur wins a race from Paris to Rouen in 1894. And the 1894 also sees the first electric car introduced in Europe. So, but we're 8 years after, well, more than 8 years, 18 years or something after the internal combustion engine is made, and 8 years after cars are driving around, that we're seeing electric cars being manufactured. So in 1895, Emile Levasseur drives 1,200 kilometers from Paris to Bordeaux in 48 hours at a speed of 25 kilometers an hour. That's supposed to kick off a car craze in the US and Europe. And Michelin is the first car to feature pneumatic tires, okay, tires with air in them. So that's going to slow, or make the ride a whole lot better. 1895, Horseless Age is the first magazine for automobiles founded in Kentucky. 1895 also sees Rudolf Diesel inventing the diesel engine. And the first cars are sold in the US in 1896. 1896, that's 10 years after Mr. Benz made and patented the first automobile, okay? And 1896 saw 320 cars made in France. That's a decade, right? So if in your business you're doing something new, different, I mean, granted, we can accelerate adoption, when we make something great, the word can get out a lot quicker and easier, but adoption cycles are slow, man. 1886, Benz, invents the car, patents the car. 1888, his wife drives over 100 miles round trip. 1896, a decade later, 320 cars are being made in France, and that's the biggest producer of automobiles at that point in time. Okay, this one's just for fun. 1898, Ferdinand Porsche designs electric vehicle with a Phaeton model. They call it a P1 for short, but whatever. I just like that Ferdinand Porsche is in the mix at some point, but that's where the Porsche mark comes from. 1898 also sees Benz sells more than 1,000 cars, mostly in France. So here we are, suddenly, right? Suddenly, 12 years later, you're getting 1,000 cars made. But think about that, compared to the population. 1899 rather, Whitney and Widener buy the electric vehicle company, and they make about 2,000 electric cars a year in 1899. Okay, in 1899, we also have 30 manufacturers in the USA, and they produce about 2,500 automobiles. Okay, bringing the total on the road to about 8,000. 40% of those are steam powered, 38% are electric, and about 22% are gas powered. Let's jump to 1900, the next year. France is producing 4,800 cars, okay, per year. So in 1899, US produced 2,500. In 1900, France produced 4,800, but then something cool happens the next year. Ransom Olds introduces the curved dash automobile at $625. That starts the Detroit automobile industry, and it's the first car in the world to be produced in large quantities. They made 600, okay, which would be a boutique thing now, right? 1901 also sees Daimler Motoren Gesellschaft introducing a 35 horsepower Mercedes. And that's a technological breakthrough, because that car now can go 90 miles an hour. That's roughly 55 miles an hour, 90 kilometers an hour, 55 miles an hour. So that's going to revolutionize things. That speeds everything up. And Olds is making 4,000 cars as of 1903. Ford made 1,700 that year. The total production in the US was 11,200. So 1903, we're starting to see things pick up, right? From 1886, though, to 1903, that's 17 years after Benz's first car. So again, this frustration of adoption and really around consumer demand and consumer changes and what they want, it can be rough. So I've had a couple of companies where I've seen successful companies come along a couple of years after we gave up and do really well with the same idea, the same concept. Stick with it, don't give up. If you know it's a great idea, maybe figure out a way to make it last, because eventually consumer behavior might catch up. And that's one of the things that's happened with COVID too, by the way, is consumer behavior has really changed much more rapidly. There've been a lot of adoption of new technologies and new delivery methods, you name it, that have happened in an accelerated fashion over the last, year and a half or so. In 1903, France is the biggest car manufacturer in the world at around 14,000 total, but about a third of those are being sold in England, Britain. And in 1904, okay, 18 years after Benz made the car, only 7% of the roads in the US are surfaced, meaning all the rest are dirt, gravel, you name it. But in 1904, also the US passes France as the main car manufacturer in the world, as the biggest car manufacturer. And most of those 40, or not most, but a plurality of those cars, 42%, are produced in the Midwest. So 1905, both in France and the US, the main car owners, I thought this was kind of cool, are physicians, especially country doctors, right? Because they have to get somewhere. So imagine physicians being the early adopters of the automobile. And in 1905, we see manufacturing jump to 25,000 cars in the US, and that's more than any other country in the world. So the US overtakes France as a producer. 1907, we produced 44,000 cars versus France's 25,000 versus Britain's 12,000 and Germany's 5,000. That's 21 years after Benz patented his car, okay? That's 19 years after Mrs. Benz drove 112 miles round trip. That we finally start to see mass production, or at least something that could pass for it. But these are pretty expensive at this stage as well. So 1907 marks the demise of the electrical vehicle company and electric car. They just didn't keep up in design and technology advances. This is just another cool one. The first long distance rally takes 2 months going from Beijing to Paris in 1907. So long distance race for 2 months. Can you imagine driving from Beijing across Asia to Paris? And October 1908, everybody, you'll know this one if you don't know the exact dates, but Ford introduces the 4-cylinder, 20 horsepower, open top Model T with one color, $825, which is a bit of a revolution because the average cost of a car at that point was $2,000. And $2,000 in 1908, that is a luxury thing. So $825, while still expensive, starts, cuts the price by more than half and starts to make it potentially accessible to more people. 1908, Buick is the largest car manufacturer though. So we know the Model T came out that year, but Buick still made the most cars at 9,000. And in 1908 also, you can get your head around this, there were 253 car manufacturers in the USA alone, okay? That's I don't know how many there were worldwide, but over 250 in the US. And again, though, that's 22 years after the patent for Mr. Benz, and less than 9% of roads in the US are surfaced. So, meaning paved, right? So, I mean, our society still hadn't caught up. Now, in 1909, Ford sells more than 10,000 Model Ts in its first full year of production. So that really blows things up, and they overtake Buick that year. And car sales that year, 1910, sales increased by 4,500%. Okay, 45 times over the previous year. And production reaches 187,000 in 1910, up from 4,000 in 1900. Okay, 1913, only 3 years later, the US produces 485,000 cars out of a world total of 606,000. So in that short time span from like 1909 to 1913, the US overtakes and starts mass producing way more automobiles than anybody else, almost 500,000 cars in the US alone. We're exporting, we're selling, domestically, and over 500,000 cars made around the world, 606,000. Okay, but again, think about that, 606,000 total cars in 1913 from 4,000 in 1910. But still, that's 4,000 in 1900. That's 13 years. Okay, and what, 1913 is 27 years after Benz patented this car. So if you got a vision, you're trying to do something different, you are frustrated with the slow adoption and consumer behavior and changes, and people don't see the need for it, stick with it. Could blow up, be right place, right time. But first to market isn't always the best. First to market doesn't necessarily mean you can dominate. You've got to get buy-in, but don't give up. Think about the cool things that you can do and stick with it. And if I can do anything to help you out, you can hit me up at sturdycoaching.com. Thanks.